Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this. Welcome from Oxford, from the Rothermere American Institute. My name is Adam Smith. I'm the director of the REI, and it's a great pleasure to introduce this panel taking place the day after these seemingly quite momentous midterm elections. Obviously, as I think probably everybody watching this will be aware, there are still many important races outstanding, but we're going to take stock of the situation as things stand right now at 12 noon Eastern time or 5 p.m. here in the UK. I will quickly introduce the panel. They'll then speak for just a few minutes each, giving us their top takeaways, and then we'll move into a Q&A. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. Don't put them in the chat box. Put them in the Q&A box, and I will try to cover as many of them as possible. We're going to run for 1 hour, so we will be finished at 6 p.m. UK time. So our panel consists of Andrea Gillespie, Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute for the Study of Race and Difference at Emory University. She earned her PhD in political science from Yale. Her research focuses on the political leadership of African-American politicians who attempted to transcend race and how Black voters respond to them. One of her most recent publications is Race in the Obama Administration, Symbols, Substance, and Hope. We are also joined by David Leal, political scientist at the University of Texas, Austin, a senior fellow at the Hoover Institute, and a specialist on Latino politics and migration. By Patrick Anderlecht, a political historian at Northumbria University and the co-editor of a new book, Midterms and Mandates. And by Frank Luntz, described by both Republicans and Democrats as America's smartest pollster, best known for his research on the impact of language on politics, and a familiar face on British television as well as in the States. Thank you, all four of you, very much indeed for joining us today, because I know you've all got a lot of other demands on your time, especially now. So I'm extremely grateful. I want to just begin, as I said, just by asking you all to give us your assessment of how things are looking right now. Andrea, can I begin with you, please?
Sure. Thank you. And thank you very much for this invitation. It is my pleasure to be here. And I'm sorry that I can't be with you in person.
One day. Yeah.
One day, yes. If I had to sum up what happened yesterday, I think we are looking at the effects of polarization, and I think we're going to have to come up with more dynamic models about predictions. We very well could get to the sort of net 20-seat gain for Republicans in the House of Representatives, but I think it's still important for us to keep in mind that that means we still have a pretty narrowly divided House of Representatives. And I think the big question coming out of yesterday's elections is whether or not that's actually going to temper the behavior of Republicans who would be in charge of the chamber, whether or not we would see a change in the tenor or tone of the investigations that they're proposing, whether or not they would actually serve to completely obstruct the rest of President Biden's agenda for the next 2 years in his term of office. I think that remains to be seen, but I think that there are other issues that come up. They're more clearly pronounced in the Senate races, but they also show up in some of the House races as well, particularly in places where we may see some surprises. And that's the issue of candidate quality. And so I think going into this election cycle, I think people thought that median voter theory was dead, and it's kind of made a little bit of a resurgence that really extremist candidates didn't always do that well. And certainly Donald Trump didn't have the magic. Like, he could get people through primaries, but he couldn't necessarily get them all through the general election cycle because they were viewed as too extreme, particularly if they were running for offices where they may have the ability to certify elections. And so that does seem to be important. So the final thing that I'll talk about briefly, and I know I'll get asked more questions about this, is whether or not I was surprised by anything that I have seen in my home state. And the short answer is not really. The one thing that surprises me is the fact that Stacey Abrams actually was not the second highest vote getter amongst the Democratic candidates in Georgia. But other than that, I think we are exactly where I expected to be. And I fully was prepared that this was going to go to a runoff in the Senate race. And I'm happy to talk about why that's happening and what the dynamics are in that race later.
Thanks, Andrew. We'll definitely can drill down a little bit into Georgia later on. Can I just ask you, I know that I'm sure that people watching this are going to be very on top of this, otherwise they probably wouldn't have found their way here, but can you just give us a couple of examples to illustrate the point that you were making about the role of candidate quality?
So, I mean, there are a number of things to think about. In the House race, the fact that Lauren Boebert is actually embattled is something that is actually very, very surprising. She's in a safe Republican district, but people are reacting to her in the same way that they reacted to Madison Cawthorn during the primaries, that there may be a bridge too far. And I think the big question that people are going to ask is, what is the contrast between her and Marjorie Taylor Greene, who very handily won her congressional race here in Georgia? And I have some, hypotheses about what may be the difference between the two of those candidates. But also, in particular, if we look at, say, the Michigan statewide races, Tudor Dixon versus Gretchen Whitmer, or Christina Caramo, who was the Republican Secretary of State candidate who was an election denier, they got repudiated in this particular election. The reason why Herschel Walker did not win outright was because he's a weak candidate. And we've known that all along. He is the political science definition of a weak candidate. Going into it, he demonstrated that throughout the course of the campaign. If only for hyperpartisanship, this race is going to a runoff, because if there weren't more Republicans than there were Democrats in Georgia, I think Raphael Warnock would have been able to dispatch him pretty easily. These kinds of things matter, and they matter in part because there were other candidates in the wings. Mm-hmm. So Gary Black, the second place finisher in Georgia, would have been a much more formidable candidate. I think Rich McCormick in Pennsylvania would have been a much more formidable candidate to John Fetterman. And so there were some mistakes that Republicans made that they're going to have to own up to. And if they don't own up to that, I think that is the barometer of how potent Trump's influence is on the party. And I think that has implications for the staying power of the Republican Party in the long term.
Thanks very much, Andrew. David Leal, can I turn to you, please?
Well, hi, thank you for inviting me. As I've been reading some of the post-election coverage of the mainstream media, it seems that the sort of cat's got their tongue. I'm not sure that they really have any good explanations for what's going on. And I found a lot of their pre-election discussion to be distinctly unhelpful in looking at the election results. So, one of the things I want to talk about, or I want to talk about a couple of things that maybe aren't being mentioned in some of this media coverage, which is, first of all, I'm wondering about the campaign issues that the candidates had, the parties had. There was a lot of culture war rhetoric, critical race theory, other kinds of issues that I think Republicans have been banking on. And I'm just not sure it worked. If it was going to work, you think you would have seen Republicans doing better in many parts of the country where they didn't do as well as they could have. They didn't win seats that they could have at the congressional level. People are going to ask, why wasn't there a red wave? Why wasn't this the 2010 midterm elections? You have to think about the kinds of issues that they were talking about. I do wonder if the culture war has like a limited resonance when it comes to a general election. It may work in the primaries, but maybe the voters aren't up for that. And I also wonder a little bit about the tone of the campaign. The Democrats struck me as candidates who felt that they had positive things, not positive as in good necessarily, but just things that they could argue for, like, we're here to get for abortion rights. Rights are being taken away and we want to get our rights back. About democracy is on the ballot. Republicans struck me in many cases as having negative campaigns. They were running against things. They were criticizing. But I didn't see a lot of positive kind of messages. And I do wonder if there was a little bit of a style issue here, because a lot of the media reports had stories on election day like, exhausted, divided, sad public trend, goes to polls. It was this kind of rhetoric about, maybe the candidates aren't that inspiring, the campaign's not that inspiring, the voters don't feel inspired, but maybe just possibly there is something about the tone of the Democratic candidate, something about more them being proactive and positive that helped. I also, as someone who's also interested in state and local politics, I'm also very interested in the gubernatorial elections. I know that almost all the coverage is on Senate and House. I know that in some of the media, you have to click a couple of times to actually get to gubernatorial results or, state ballot initiative results. The mainstream media just doesn't care about state politics, it seems. Neither does political science, by the way. But I think about how the Democrats basically ran the table in these gubernatorial elections. Think about Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. That strikes me as having a lot of continuity with how Biden did in the 2020 election, a big major contrast between how Trump did in 2016. And I think that having Democrats in those positions sometimes, and other statewide offices too, like Secretary of State and AG and all of that, I think that that's going to be it's big for the Democrats going into the next election. So I think there's a lot of reasons why Democrats are going to be motivated for the next election, whereas they might not have been. And I think these state victories are going to be a part of that, even if they're not being talked about, I think, by the media. I think that this is something that within Democratic circles is going to be an important point. And also just generally too, and I'm sure Frank and others Patrick can talk more about this, is also just about sort of like the failure of the mainstream media. I just found that the last couple of weeks were just like a storm of red wave stories. And I don't mean like a rain, a gentle rainstorm. I mean like a Texas hailstorm where like, golf ball sized pieces of ice are battering your roof. It was just nothing but red wave for maybe 2 or 3 weeks going into the election, with a little bit of hints that there might be election violence. In retrospect, none of that was particularly useful. And I also wonder about the themes that the media were talking about, like inflation, democracy. Sure, I think that these things probably played a role, but I just don't feel like, some of the media polling that was out there really sort of, captured the mix of issues that maybe the voters, and the tone of the issues that the voters were responding to. And I can also talk more about Latinos than the Latino vote later on, so we can get to that. That's enough for my introductory statement.
David, thank you so much. And I definitely, we're certainly going to come to the Latino vote, because that's incredibly interesting and important. I just have one quick follow-up on your last point. Are you confident that political scientists are going to be able to understand in a fully fledged way the issues that motivated voters?
I think that's always a tricky question in political science, because as Andrew said, there's a lot of polarization. Do issues always, have independent effects on outcomes? What is the role for issues in like a highly partisan, polarized kind of political environment? There's also the bigger picture kind of dynamic, which relates to political scientist Mo Fiorina's book, Unstable Majorities, which is that in many ways, the public is bunched up toward the middle on lots of public policy issues. But, but as many people say, the parties have gone to the wings. And so, the public is in this difficult kind of position where it really is much more moderate than the political class. And what do you do in those situations? Well, people are either going back or forth, or maybe in this election, we have a stalemate. So I think that's the kind of context we also have to think about too. I know that a lot of commentators live in a perpetual present, but I think that when we sort of go back and look at all of the past election results, we do see this widespread pattern of back and forth. And in many ways, this kind of, looks like that. So I know we're always trying to pin issues on election results. I think that those can be important, obviously, but I lots of other long-term kind of structural factors that are influencing the outcomes that we have to pay attention to.
Thank you. It sounds like in a way you're echoing Andra's point, that one of her points that struck me at the beginning of her remarks about suggestion that perhaps political scientists need to find new models or new ways of understanding polarization, which is perhaps a point we can return to. Patrick Anderlecht.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Really great to be part of this panel. Like the others, I'm sorry I can't be there in person. Definitely would, echo the points that Andrew and David have just made. It's sort of an iron law of midterms, or it's assumed to be a kind of iron law of midterms, that the president's party will lose seats. Since 1900, there's only been 3 midterm elections: 1934, 1998, and 2002, and that hasn't happened in either the House or the Senate. And I think certainly since 2006, we've kind of become used to this kind of cycle where the midterms represent kind of decisive rejection of the president's party, whether that's, George W. Bush's thumping in 2006, Obama's shellacking 2010, Donald Trump's not, great night in 2018. But that's very clearly not what happened this time. And although it will probably be some weeks, if not months, before we have a clear sense of what had happened. It's a bit like Bill Clinton's quote in 2000, the people have spoken, but it'll take some time to figure out what they've said. It's very clear that I think that, it's been a very kind of mixed picture, and the for the Biden administration, for the Democratic Party more broadly, for the representing the kind of incumbent party, this is a broadly pretty good night. And I would also say, and one of the things that strikes me that because I'm primarily a historian of the Democratic Party is that in some respects, this is actually a better night for the Democratic Party more widely than 2020 was, because although for a lot of progressives, the big kind of headline of 2020 was the defeat of Donald Trump, and I'm not minimizing that, but in some respects, this election demonstrates, for all the reasons that have been cited, the vitality of the Democratic Party across the country, whether that's in Michigan or in Georgia and Arizona and in a variety of places where the Democratic Party is holding up quite well, because we sort of saw through the Obama years and through the Trump years a real kind of decaying of the Democratic Party, not certainly at the kind of sub-congressional level, at the level of the state and the county, and actually this represents something of a recovery in a lot of places, I think. The other point to make, I think there really has been a kind of, we're going to hear a lot of people talking about this as a polling failure, and I don't think it was. Like, I saw a great many polls leading up to this election that essentially suggested that the Democrats were, kind of pretty close to the Republicans in the generic ballot, that those Senate seats were very competitive, as they're kind of proving to be. Kind of as David was saying, what there has sort of been is kind of a narrative failure. There's just been this assumption that there's a kind of red wave coming. People have persuaded themselves. And I think, those on the left are always kind of, liable to get themselves into a panic quite quickly, and so there's certainly, if you kind of follow this through the prism of Twitter, there's been this kind of assumption of like, oh, there's clearly a disaster coming. And I suppose, having lived through any number of kind of polling misses or election nights that don't go quite as you were expecting, that wouldn't be a surprise. But yeah, those I would say would be my kind of key takeaways here.
Paddy, can I just follow up on one thing? So Andrea at the beginning was talking about the role of candidate quality. Thinking about, she was citing examples on the Republican side of poor quality candidates who underperformed where you might expect a generic Republican to have been. Have you got any comment at this early stage on among Democratic candidates in competitive races on the role of candidate quality?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, it's not exclusively, but on the whole, one of the kind of big advantages for the Democratic Party in this cycle has been that their kind of candidates have been, I think, of broadly better quality than some of their Republican competitors. I mean, if you take the example of Pennsylvania, right, which is an extremely competitive seat, should be the Pennsylvania Senate race, I should say, should be a winnable race in an election year like this, with the fundamentals looking like they are. And you have a candidate like John Fetterman, who is clearly kind of much better suited to that climate, who adopts this kind of strategy of kind of trying to run across the entire state, trying to compete in Trump-leaning counties, not on the basis that he can win them, but on the basis that he can kind of bring those numbers down a bit, those sort of pro-Trump numbers down a bit, to his benefit, to the benefit of the Democratic Party. Contrast that with some of the kind of errors that someone like Mehmet Oz has made, which, as others were pointing out, there were stronger candidates in those kind of primaries who definitely probably could have won in this year. Same in the governor's race, Josh Shapiro versus someone like Doug Mastriano. Yeah, so I think kind of candidate quality is a big part of the explanation here, and to that extent, it's very similar, or it's reminiscent in some respects to the 2010 midterms. Which, if you look at, say, the Senate map in 2010, there are a number of races that probably should have tipped that in favor of the Republican Party, just given the generic ballot. And I think candidate quality really affected things there.
Okay, thanks very much, Paddy. Frank Luntz.
It's very hard because for the first time ever, if anyone's ever been on a panel with me, I'm the person who argues, the one who makes it lively. And everything that you all said, I agree with. So I don't have that much.
Find something to argue with, Frank.
Yeah, the weather in Washington today is worse than the weather in the UK. That's about the best I can do. I'll add two things. Number one is that last night, for better or worse, was Ron DeSantis's night. He probably more than any other elected official other than Joe Biden had a great evening. And he had a great evening by demonstrating his ability to draw among voters who normally don't vote Republican. Florida, it can no longer, and this is the second point, is that Florida can no longer be seen as a swing state. Florida is now a Republican state. And still, DeSantis was able to excel in the Latino and Hispanic communities to a degree that most Republicans do not do. And I don't just mean the Cuban community, the other Latino communities in Florida. And he now is perfectly positioned to take on Donald Trump, who lost race after race after race after race after race yesterday. And probably it's going to result in a lot of interscene warfare within the GOP if Trump is so arrogant that he actually keeps to his public pronouncements about announcing for president next Tuesday. Watch what happens. There's a line, I'm trying to figure out how to say it without offending people, but it's something to the effect of, if you think the shit stinks now, think of what it'll smell like a week from now. And I think that that could happen with Trump, because for the first time, Republicans across the spectrum are pissed at him for not shutting up, for getting involved, for pushing candidates that were clearly inferior. And so those are basically my three trends or my three observations. I will tell you that we're doing a focus group tonight because I'm determined to figure out what happened and why. The New York Times is sponsoring it, and then we're going to put our results into the field tomorrow. So if you have another gathering 96 hours from now, will be much more intelligent, because what happened yesterday, make no mistake, I don't care what people spin it as. Republicans were shocked at how badly they did. Democrats were shocked at how well they did, and nobody really understands why.
A couple of things, Frank. Can you comment on the accuracy or otherwise of the polls? I mean, Nate Silver is obviously saying that the polling has been vindicated, but you would expect him to say it, wouldn't you? What do you think?
Well, he's been slammed so many times, and it's an example of the tall poppy syndrome. Don't pick your head up or poke your head up, because you'll get shot down. I canceled all of my appearances today on media, except for this conference, except for this discussion, because there's no way I'm going into the public. I don't know. I look at this last minute polling, and a lot of these Republican online polling firms that I never heard about suddenly popped up with the Republicans predicting 30 or 40 House seats. Newt Gingrich, I want this to be quoted. Newt Gingrich projected on Fox News 50 seats. It's insane. So I don't think that the polling is as bad as some people think it is. I don't think it's as good as pollsters would like it to be, but I don't think it's important. I don't really care who's going to win or lose. I care much more about what it means for the country and what it means for the people in the country.
Another quick question, if I can, Frank. Can you comment on David Leal raised the issue of whether the kind of broad, to summarize, basically, you can correct me if I'm not summarizing you correctly, David, but the cultural, questioning whether or not the culture war issues that Republican candidates ran on worked or not.
We don't know, because we know what happened last year. Education was never a nationwide Republican issue. They eschewed it because they believe education is up to the states and up to the local communities. And all of a sudden you had it just exploded because of a gubernatorial debate. And it turned into an issue that actually helped the Republican get elected. But I don't want to suggest that what happened in Virginia has any impact on what happened nationwide. And quite frankly, the cultural discussions were not significant in 2022. They would try to touch it, but they weren't overt. It wasn't direct. And most people, we're going to spend more time in this conversation talking politics than the average community at Oxford spends in a year. So they don't pay attention to this. The one exception to that, because I do think it's cultural, is abortion. And I'm convinced that the Roe v. Wade changed the outcome of this race, because it agitated and aggravated and energized a group of young women between the ages of 18 and 39 that otherwise might not have voted. And they were absolutely, definitely determined to come vote, and would have killed anyone in their way to have voted, because this matters to them. And what I hope to be able to do is to quantify that in the next 96 hours. I know it anecdotally, and I know it from the exit polling that abortion for a lot of people was their first or second most important issue. It did not exist on the radar until Roe v. Wade was overturned.
Thanks. So Frank then at the end there raises this obviously fundamental question of turnout and differential turnout, which is obviously important, but by definition in every election, but perhaps particularly so in midterms. Andrea, can I just ask for your reaction to what Frank has just said there, particularly about the impact of the Dobbs decision? I understand, of course, that as Frank has been emphasizing, we don't yet have the data that hopefully we will have in the coming days and weeks to be confident in an assessment about what is driving voters. But from what you've picked up, and you are there in ground zero in Georgia, I mean, what is your sense of what the impact of the Dobbs decision was on this election?
I agree with Frank that I think that's a testable proposition. The questions that I have relate to whether or not we're actually asking the right questions. So in some ways, I want to piggyback off of a lot of what Frank said. One of the things that I would fault the American media for, and I say this knowing that I got lots of interviews behind questions like this, was that there was an overemphasis on the horse race, and to the point that it actually made it harder to actually figure out what was going on, because anytime there was any movement, usually not statistically significant in the polls, people were all up in arms and trying to interpret things that weren't there. And so the metaphor that I like to use to think about polling is, and I will out myself, is before I started working at Emory, I spent a year working for Mark Mellman, the Democratic pollster, is polls are saws, they're not scalpels. And I think a lot of people's preoccupation with polls is that they expect it to predict results with surgical precision, and they're just not designed to do that. We don't have the type of money that we would need to have those types of sample sizes to be that precise. And so I think we sometimes expect polls to tell us things that they're not telling us, and that we don't understand that oftentimes what it's giving us is a range of answers where we know sort of the truth lies. And I don't know if we're all as statistically literate to be able to parse those things out as necessary. That being said, polls are as good as the questions that they ask. And so with respect to abortion, yeah, I mean, we certainly see that for voters who cared about abortion, they voted Democratic. That's not surprising. And Frank, it's true. I remember when I was working, in Washington, D.C. 15 years ago, I was shocked when abortion would kind of come up as an issue, because I was like, this is settled at this point. I don't know why this is animating. But the prospect of having rights taken away from people who cared about them, I think did have the potential to be galvanizing. But one caveat is, we still are worried about low voter turnout amongst young voters because of life cycle effects that suggest that young people are flaky and will not actually hit their peak probability of voter turnout until they start to approach middle age. I think that that's still a factor. There is certainly a factor in my state. And the big question that I have is that the exit poll survey data asked questions about, what's your most important issue, where abortion was included. It asked about opinions about the Dobbs decision and general attitudes about abortion. And so we know that there was polarization along abortion that would actually fit the left-right ideological continuum. Pro-choice people are Democrats, pro-life people are Republicans. That's not surprising. It's not true. I think actually the better question, and not everybody is asking it, but I will applaud the Public Religion Research Institute, of which I'm a board member, that they are asking this question in a way that I actually find really interesting. They're asking respondents to indicate if a candidate's views on abortion are a deal breaker for them. So if a candidate disagrees with you on abortion, is that a reason for you to not vote for them? That question doesn't get asked that often. And when they asked this in June, right after the Dobbs decision, what they saw was an increase in the number of Democrats who said that, yes, abortion views would be a deal breaker for them. I do think that that's highly predictive, but unfortunately that wasn't asked in the Edison polls. So we're not going to know that answer to the question. If it shows up in other survey instruments, I have one out in the field where I ask that question, that's one thing that I'm going to be interested in. And the reason why I think that that's important is abortion, I think, is important. It may not have ranked at the top of everybody's list. So if you ask somebody, to choose between like inflation and abortion and crime and guns, they may have chosen one of the other issues, but it could be, all else being equal, abortion could be the decision or the tie break between one candidate or another if partisan isn't the real thing that's going on there. So, I think that, we just need to think about being more creative and also understanding the limits of our questions and not reading more that's into them. But I mean, I think it is totally plausible that, cultural issues, particularly abortion, did play a role in this election in some critical races.
Thank you. That's so interesting. So what you're suggesting there is as it were a new way of measuring the salience of issues, and that's I mean, thank you so much. That's so interesting. I wonder if we're getting. Thank you so much to the audience for sending questions in. I'm getting a lot of questions here. Let me try to. I want to bring in some of these audience members. So. We have a question here about Trumpism. Was this election a referendum on Trumpism, and to what extent is the Republican Party divided? Frank, I'm going to turn to you first on that, and then I'll bring in David Leal. Yeah, can you talk? I mean, you've already touched on this, Frank, but can you talk a little bit more about the Trump factor?
Yeah, I'm going to do something that moderators hate. Andra, the race in Kansas, when they held their primaries and they had the abortion, the amendment on the ballot, that drove turnout to such a huge degree. And that continued to affect politics in Kansas and frankly, across the Midwest. So abortion has moved from a narrow issue to what gay rights and same-sex marriage used to do 20 years ago. It may not be your top issue or your second or your third issue, but boy, does it motivate a segment of the population to participate. Now, in terms of Trump, we've never had a situation where an ex-president is as important to an election as a current president. And we believe, and we're going to ask this, and by the way, Andra, I'm going to add the question you mentioned to our survey as well, so we should talk after this is done. I actually believe that there could have been as much of a response to Donald Trump and his mishegas as there was to Joe Biden and his administration. And I want to try to figure that out because we all know how powerful, in fact, I'll say this to the viewers. I've never seen a Republican, including Ronald Reagan, who had more power within the GOP to anoint someone and to take someone not even qualified or capable and make them the Senate nominee. Donald Trump is unprecedented. He's unparalleled. But I've never seen someone so hated, not just by Democrats, but also by independents. And that's where I believe the election was won, not by age, not by gender, socioeconomic status, people who are politically independent, regardless of whether they were 18 or 80. They normally vote Republican over Democrat by 55-45. If the Republicans get 60% or higher, they win the election. If the Republicans get 50% or lower, which is what happened here, the Democrats win. And independents hate Donald Trump. They hate what he stands for. They hate how he speaks. They hate the polarization that's all around him. And so I do believe that Donald Trump was an essential factor. And if we did a regression analysis or a log linear linkage, I think that you would find opinions of Donald Trump to be even more important than opinions of Joe Biden in what happened yesterday.
David, I want to bring you in on, I mean, you can comment, please do, if you wish, on the kind of Trumpism issue in general, but I also want to ask you perhaps a related question about one of your areas of expertise, which is the Latino vote, in quotation marks. Can you talk about what perhaps, in the era of Trump, we're seeing how is that vote changing? Do we have any evidence from yesterday's elections that helps to inform us about the possibly changing voting habits of the different types of Latino populations within the United States?
Right. And I also hope we can circle back to the question asked by the commentator about, to what extent is the Republican Party divided? Because
yeah,
I think
sure.
very clear,
absolutely. Yeah.
But about the Latino vote, I mean, for some time, there's been this idea in Democratic Party circles of demography as destiny, and that demographic change is just going to slowly but surely be kind of like a rising tide that lifts Democratic votes into the Democratic candidates into office, and that all they really have to do is sort of kick back and wait for a demographic dividend. And yes, there may be bumps on the road with a particular election or two, but the long-term future was good. And this was something that was really, I think, ingrained in a lot of the Democratic Party and its outreach efforts. And I think their attitudes toward Latinos was always a little patronizing, like, well, you're gonna be Democrats, maybe not 100% Democrats, but you're gonna be Democrats, so we don't really have to do very much. We don't really have to understand you either. And I think we started to see evidence of this in a couple of places when we look back on this, and when we see the transformation of the Latino vote from being predominantly Democratic to, I think, being much more split in a sort of traditional European ethnic migration way, because I think that's a very possible pattern that we're going to see with Latinos. We may be seeing evidence of it already. We've always seen evidence of Latino GOP support with candidates who are known for their, outreach for Latinos, like Reagan in '84 or Bush in 2000 and 2004. It hadn't really been tested by a candidate like Trump. But in 2016, I think we saw, and there were claims about this, but I think the evidence shows that the Latino vote for Trump was about the same as it was for Romney in 2012. And I know there's been pushback on that, but I think that that's true. And I think that in 2020, we clearly saw a big increase in the Latino vote, and not just, I think some Democrats wanted to say, well, it's really just a South Texas, South Florida kind of effect. But I think the evidence is much stronger that in many places, California, many other states, we were seeing Latinos moving more toward not just the GOP, but toward Trump. And I think that it's going to be difficult for Latinos to really hold this Latino population in the camp, in its winning coalition. Because if we look at what we're seeing now, it's not just a matter of a few elections. It's, I think, the whole dynamic within Latino politics is changing, whereby there's real competition for Latinos now, and a lot of it's being done officially through the GOP and its candidates, but it's also being done in many informal ways through religion, through evangelical Pentecostal religious communities. I think there's just a lot of movement in the grassroots that's pushing for the GOP and for conservative politics and values within Latino communities. I think that Latinos themselves are really starting to realize that they have choices here, and that they don't have to be Democrats, that the Democratic Party has moved to the left in a way that I think has, in some ways, left, quote unquote, many Latino voters behind. And I think that many Latinos are wondering whether or not they really should support the Democratic Party. And at the same time, you have this new Republican push. It may also play in a little bit to the diploma gap, to the resurgence of working class voters for the Republican Party. That may be playing out within Latino communities also. I think there's some evidence in the data for that. And if you look at the actual election results, like in Texas and South Texas, there were 3 congressional seats, and some of the media has been saying, well, the Democrats, they won 2 out of 3, but I mean, one of them is a very conservative Democrat, the only, anti-abortion Democrat left in the House. I don't think that's really what the Democrats want. Yes, they won a Democratic seat where they have a fairly standard for the contemporary Democratic Party candidate, but they lost the district that's in the middle, the one that goes from the border all the way up to San Antonio. And so for a Republican to win, a Latina to win, I know people will say that, well, Mayra Flores, she lost, but she also lost a different district. The one that she won in the special election is not the same one that she won, that she lost in the general election. So the redistricting process it's a little bit of an apples to orange comparison. And then you look at Nevada, that's going down to the wire. Why is that? That was supposed to be one of those places where the Democrats had really sort of, ridden a Latino wave into office. It's supposed to be becoming a blue state. Maybe it's not. Arizona's a more complicated place, but still, I just don't know if these sort of claims about demography as destiny are really being reflected in the real world.
Mm. Do you have a comment, David, on, we have a question here from Anne Schofield, who says on the culture war issues, given the number of times Ron DeSantis said woke in his acceptance speech, she says, I have to feel culture war issues were pretty important in Florida. Might culture war issues be a factor in the Cuban vote in Florida, but also perhaps in some of these other Latino communities that are trending more towards the Republicans?
I have a feeling that the Latino vote is, there may be some cultural conservatism, but that doesn't necessarily translate into votes for any particular party, as we've seen in parts of the African-American community. I think that we do have a situation whereby maybe the idea of who the Latino voter is has been mistaken. Maybe Latino voters are really like New Deal voters. I think that there are some people in the Democrats who have hoped that they would be more sort of on the left in general, like the new contemporary kind of Democratic activists, but it's possible that they're really more like, the sort of New Deal, economic focused, maybe in some ways culturally conservative. Maybe we've had a Latino population that is lower income, lower education, less secure jobs, less healthcare. Maybe they are open to the party that has been saying, we're from the government and we're here to help. And that was also true for a lot of immigrant communities in America too in the 20th century. But they moved, they diversified. Now, the Irish, Italian, white Catholic vote is more Republican than Democratic, and we could be getting to a situation like that down the road also. So I think that I did notice that that DeSantis said woke a lot. I'm not sure if that worked outside of Florida. I'm not sure if it even is responsible for Florida. Certainly people are talking about DeSantis as being one of the big winners of this, but I guess there could be a response, which would be, well, maybe Florida is just different. And maybe what works in Florida doesn't work in the rest of the country. There could be this idea that those maps show the red wave happened in Florida, just nowhere else.
Right.
So who knows if that message
there may be some Florida exceptionalism going on. Paddy, I want to turn to you because there's a number of people asking about election denialism. Eldred Harrington is speculating that around about 200 election deniers may have won election yesterday. Do you have a comment, Paddy, on the relevance of that issue? The question that Democrats were more in some races than others really focusing on, which was the health of American democracy, that American democracy itself was at stake, that if this other guy wins, then, who knows, this may be the last time you get to vote at all, in a meaningful way, at least.
Yeah, I mean, it was something that certainly that President Biden kind of really emphasized in the final weeks of the campaign, and I suppose at this stage, I think the only thing we can really say about that is that it clearly didn't hurt the Democrats. I don't know whether it had the same galvanic effect on Democratic voters as abortion did, for example, although I'm sure there obviously were some who did turn out for that reason. But yes, at the very least, it wasn't as enough of a kind of drag. And in some respects, I think the kind of the broader story of these midterms, the thing that people are kind of puzzling out are that the fundamentals of this year, the kind of the economic fundamentals, if you look at inflation, wage growth, things like that, and if you look at the president's approval ratings, that would suggest a bigger gain for the Republican Party or the opposition party, the non-incumbent party, than we have seen. So clearly what is happening is something is kind of buoying up the incumbent party. And that we're kind of puzzling out what exactly that is and what the balance of that is. Whether that is, that's kind of abortion galvanizing voters, whether that's concerns over democracy, whether that's just superior candidate quality in key races. I think it's absolutely, it's true that that a number of people who had kind of committed themselves to election denialism have won their races. I think in some respects where, there might be a kind of silver lining here is that most of the bigger and high profile ones seem to lose. And I think the narrative or the story that will form coming out of this, and probably the story that will form coming out of this in the Republican Party, or at least in some parts of the Republican Party, is that this was not helpful. And this was not a kind of an effective message to go into the election with. At a practical level, however, I think it is significant that although there are kind of a number of kind of election denialists who have won their seats, they're mostly at local levels, right? I think it is hugely important that Josh Shapiro won the Pennsylvania governor's race rather than Doug Mastriano, right? That is going to be very significant going into 2024. Same with candidates in a variety of other races. We'll see what happens in kind of Arizona with between Hobbs and Lake. But that could be something that could be something that determines the course of 2024. But yes, I think what we would see is that probably this isn't by any stretch the end of that kind of strain of election denialism in the Republican Party. And you can certainly see some conservative commentators who are already rationalizing this defeat as an example of kind of being, the election being stolen by wily Democratic officials. But I think you can't really point to this as something where that kind of denialism has really carried a wave of candidates to victory. And a huge amount of that is just united to the fact that a lot of the candidates Trump endorsed have lost. And that kind of election denialism is sort of a prerequisite of candidates that he will endorse, who have to kind of accept his version of 2020. I mean, this is a candidate who's claiming election fraud in elections he won in 2016, So it's a sort of peculiar outcome. But yeah, I'll stop. rambling on that.
Andrea, I do want to, I'm conscious of the time, and I don't want to finish this panel without talking a little bit more about Georgia. And in particular, we've got some questions from the audience about, well, basically to summarize, what happened to Stacey Abrams?
This race was entirely different from 2018, and I think a lot of people forgot that. So 2018 was an open contest where neither Brian Kemp nor Stacey Abrams had been governor before, so they were much more evenly matched. And nationally speaking, despite the fact that the red wave didn't materialize in the way that we thought, 2018 was a much more favorable year for Democrats than 2022 is. And so Stacey Abrams had a lot of wind at her back, if you will, that would help support and propel her candidacy. That didn't exist in 2022. Brian Kemp had 4 more years of being governor than she had by this point. And he kept his campaign promises, and Republicans were satisfied with what he had done. He also had at his disposal federal COVID money that he was able to dispense to voters. So in a somewhat clientelist type of way. So there were tax rebates, and there's been a gas tax holiday, in the state of Georgia, which is why we have much cheaper gas than other people do around the country. So there are all of these things that Kemp had at his disposal because he was governor that he leveraged to his advantage. And so we can't discount the importance of incumbency advantage. There are some other dynamics that may be coming out probably that are amplified in the absence of having certain types of national advantages that I think do need to be discussed. So in particular, one of the things that I am very interested in and a lot of my colleagues are interested in is whether or not Abrams' intersectional identity as a Black woman actually ended up being a net disadvantage to her, and whether or not she was judged differently and more harshly because of her race and gender. I say this noting that Black women candidates actually fared particularly poorly yesterday. In some instances, this was to be expected. I didn't expect Deirdre DeGier in Iowa or Yolanda Flowers in Alabama, for instance, to win their gubernatorial races. But, there was a lot of grumblings that perhaps Democrats could have poured more money into the North Carolina Senate race. They're also saying that about Florida, too, with Val Demings. So I think we do have to ask larger questions about, how Black women candidates fare in races and whether or not a combination of racism and sexism might actually present different challenges that actually may put them in a different position than perhaps some of their white female counterparts. But I mean, the fundamentals of this race were entirely different, and Abrams was still the underdog, despite what a lot of people felt, about the outcome of the 2018 election.
Andrea, can I just follow up on that by asking you about Black men? Mm-hmm. Can you just offer a comment on the apparent evidence which shows that African-American men are, clearly the overwhelming majority of them are still voting for Democratic candidates, but if Republicans can just peel off a portion of African-American men, then that presumably in a key close race, such as the races that you always nowadays seem to have in Georgia, can make a difference.
Well, I think what most people are wrapping their heads around now, and it's something we should have realized before because the evidence is there, the data is there, there's a gender gap in Black communities. So we think of Blacks as being so overwhelmingly and uniformly Democratic in their voting behavior that we forget that there are nuances and differences within the African-American community. And one of the places where this is true is in terms of voting behavior. So Black men actually for the last few election cycles have been noticeably more Republican in their voting behavior than Black women are. So the gender gap that we talk about nationally is actually, really, it's true in communities of color. It's especially true in Black communities. And in fact, it may be Black women who are overrepresented in the electorate relative to Black men who are driving our national understanding of what gender gaps look like. So we shouldn't be surprised if we see those gaps. Over the course of the election cycle, some of the tracking polls had, Abrams substantially behind Raphael Warnock, in terms of her support amongst African-American men, and people were throwing up their hands when polls would say, oh my gosh, Stacey Abrams only has 70 or 80% of the Black vote with lots of undecideds left. Does this mean that her support amongst Black voters is eroding? If we look at the exit polls, she and Warnock end up in about the same place. Warnock does do better among Black men than she does. And so there are some places where we do see some small differences. But at the end of the day, Black men are still the second most loyal Democratic voting bloc in the United States. And their performance is within that range of where we have seen Black men vote Democratic versus Republican in midterm and in presidential elections within recent election cycles. So yeah, it's there. We usually don't have enough of a sample size to be able to parse that out. So we're going to argue and explain that in political science. science, but there isn't anything that I've seen that is so unusual that I would be talking about the crisis, of the African-American male vote for Democratic candidates at this point.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Frank, I want to turn back to you and ask you, there's a number of questions appearing here about the consequences, or what we speculate from at this point, maybe the consequence of this election for the parties and for the country as a whole. You've already talked, Frank, about about Republicans who are pissed with Trump. How do you read, how do you think the Republican Party, and I guess by that I mean, the congressional party and party leaders, and I guess donors and everyone involved in the ecosystem of the Republican Party, but what are your thoughts right now about how they're going to react to what appears to be unfolding in these elections?
It's unclear, because you have a number of big donors who are considered mainstream Republicans in Texas and in Florida who love Donald Trump. And they love Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump, even though the two of them could not be more different in their approach, in their politics, in how they speak to each other, in their agenda. Big difference on immigration, big difference on trade. And yet they love both of them equally. And so I'm not sure that when I think of the impact, I think, what does this mean for Kevin McCarthy as he tries to become the Speaker of the House? All it takes, with, let's say he gets a majority of 10, is for 10 Republicans to vote to abstain, to vote present, and he cannot occupy that speaker's chair. And this is something that Pelosi was scared to death over in 2021, because there are a few Democrats that are still at home over COVID. You cannot vote by proxy for the speaker's race. And she ended up having only a single vote more than what she needed, or she herself would not have been able to occupy the speaker's chair. And in fact, there was one moment when she didn't even have that. And so I just expect that we're going to have a period of ugliness within the Republican caucus, of certain members that most of you know, who will be voting to force the speaker to vacate the chair, who will be pushing forward votes of no confidence, which is a little bit different in a republic rather than a parliamentary system. And the thing that I just don't want to have, and I will move to Britain, and Adam, I will end up in that Zoom photograph. It looks like a statue behind you to your right. I will be sleeping under that statue if Republicans do the same kind of batshit crazy crap that they did under Trump. And I think, unfortunately, with 5 or 6 votes separating Republicans from Democrats, I actually expect that to happen.
And is that, and by the way, I take it then that would at this point be your prediction or your expectation based on what you're seeing, that you'll be looking at maybe even a single figures Republican majority in the House.
My projection, based on how these votes have been breaking this morning, because we're now almost up to 1 o'clock, is that unlike 2020, these last votes that are coming in do not seem to be helping the Democrats overwhelmingly. In 2020, and then the elections in Georgia, that last 10% just went overwhelmingly Democrat. And even if he had a 3 or 4 point lead with 90% counted, people still lost. That's not happening here. And I think that there are going to be a fair number of seats that break Republican of these last 20 or 25 that have not been decided. So if you ask me to project, I think the Republicans gain 12 seats from what they have now, and that puts them at 224, which is a majority of 6, which is not a lot.
And while we're on predictions, then the Senate.
I'm trying to figure out where those votes are in Nevada. If they are in Clark County, that suggests the Democratic incumbent wins. If they are any place else other than downtown Reno, it suggests the Republicans win. Laxalt now has a 2% lead with about 80% counted. It can close, and I can't figure out where those votes come from. The Nevada's, I've been doing it while I was here. The Nevada Secretary of State is not helpful. So if I had to bet on it, I bet the Republican wins there. but I'm not convinced at all. There's no conviction in that projection.
David, I was actually going to ask you about Western states in general, and Nevada in particular. I don't know if you want to come in on this and comment on what Frank's just said.
Oh, I think it's entirely possible that the Democrat could lose the gubernatorial and the Senate race in Nevada. I think that would be a big defeat for Democratic expectations about how, again, demographic change in the Latino vote and the immigrant vote is supposed to, have a rising tide that lifts all candidates. I think this would be just a really kind of almost an amazing setback for the party, because there's been a lot of talk, of course, about South Texas and about Florida and some other places too. In the Western states in general, Colorado was called relatively early. If there was going to be a red wave, I would have thought that we would have seen more of that in Colorado. And so that was one of those early kind of calls, governor and Senate, that suggested that there wasn't going to be that kind of a wave. But, Colorado, New Mexico, these are states that didn't used to be blue states. They used to be purple or even red. And I don't think that Latino voters themselves have been responsible for, all of these kinds of changes. I think there's always this attempt to say, have Latinos shifted elections or swung elections? I think the proper way to think about it are how are Latino voters part of the winning or losing coalitions of the candidates? And Latinos have been in some winning coalitions. They've been in some losing coalitions. But I think that there's more, as I said, I think there's more competition for the Latino vote. There's more kind of grassroots activism. I know that some people in the Democratic circles are saying, well, it's all about misinformation, it's all about, lies on social media. It's, it's big money that's coming in from the outside. This is top down. This isn't really grassroots. But I don't think I agree with that. I think that there's a lot more kind of bubbling up from the grassroots Latinos themselves who are, deciding what they want to do. And they're questioning, I think, that the sort of conventional narrative that Latinos are predominantly Democratic Party voters. I think they're looking at the parties. I think Trump has sort of shaken loose some Latinos, but it's just caused a lot of new activism in Latino communities, business groups, like the Libre Initiative. Think about like churches. I think there are a lot of people who I don't think we can say are just being in some ways manipulated. I think that's very patronizing. All this talk about misinformation. There's been misinformation for 200 plus years in American politics. I don't think it's like a new thing that's uniquely affecting Latino voters in South Texas. So
right.
I don't like a lot of this kind of talk about it. But losing Nevada would be an amazing defeat for the Democrats and for their Latino demographic dreams.
And I got one more state, because this is a very significant race. And if what happens, we're going to be a very different country. And that is Carrie Lake in Arizona. There are no candidates like her. She is so loud, so determined to put forward her point of view. She's so much more than Donald Trump with the dress. That is so unfair. She's better than he is. She's smarter than he is. She's quicker than he is. She's fearless, even much more than he is. And I'm told in Arizona that they believe that when the last 800,000 votes are counted, she will narrowly go ahead and she'll be elected governor. That is going to change American politics. Mark my words.
Do you want to just add another sentence on that? How's it going to change American politics?
Because we're going to have someone who daily is an elected official, not an outsider, who knows how to deal with the media, who knows how to be credible. She understands the skills of a reporter, and yet she's an elected official. And I am scared to death that it's going to make it so much harder for us to have a rational, respectful, civil conversation if she, in fact, does become governor.
And she's an election denier, right?
That's correct.
I'm conscious that we are now running out of time, but we have lots of questions about 2024. I want to ask you all to be really, really brief here. But can I just ask all of you just to give me a couple of sentences on how things, given what we know right now, what do you think this means for 2024? Andra, do you want to go first?
Sure. I think one of the biggest questions that came out of yesterday was whether or not this marked the end of Joe Biden's political career. And, I think that this has now left the door open to him having a 2024 run. Given his age, this is still a wild card. We don't know if this is, but I don't think people are going to be viewing him as inept or having the conversation about, he really shouldn't run because he's a drag on the party. That wasn't the result of last night. Whether or not Donald Trump would actually see the warning signs and choose to stand down, I think has a lot to do with his own personal ego and personality. So I think that he is still a wild card. And what I would say is that this is an inflection point for the Republican Party. We have seen a collective action issue for the last 6 years about whether or not Republicans would band together to stand up to Donald Trump. And so I think the big question is, given the underperformance last night, is there a critical mass of Republicans who is willing to rise up and tell Donald Trump, you are wrong, we know more about this than you do, and you can, bark all you want, but we're going to go in a different direction. And I think that that's the true testing point. We haven't really seen that happen in the last 6 years, but I think it'll be a question of whether or not people will feel emboldened to do that after last night.
We will see.
Yeah.
Paddy.
Yes, no, I would agree with that. That I think this has substantially strengthened Joe Biden's position within the Democratic Party, and I would expect he's probably going to be the candidate unless, as Andrew says, he decides to step down, and he will be, I think, 81 by the time 2024 rolls around. So that's not a kind of that's not an inconsiderable thing. But I do tend to think that people who run for president really want to be the president. So it's kind of difficult to get their fingers off it unless they absolutely have to be forced to. I think thinking about what's going to happen to Congress, I think given how narrow the margins are likely to be, that's going to make both the House and the Senate, whoever wins it this time, very competitive next time. And assuming, even if the Democrats were to lose both chambers, over the next few weeks, I think they would probably be relatively hopeful of retaking both in 2024. There's also a kind of open question about whether, for instance, the Democrats will have the same, leadership, for instance, in the House, the kind of the triumvirate at the top of the House Democratic Caucus, Nancy Pelosi, Steny Hoyer, Jim Clyburn. They've been there since about 2003. There's a lot of discussion about when and whether they're going to kind of step down and step aside. And I think the unexpected robustness of the Democratic Party in Congress in this cycle has, I think, reassured a lot of anxieties about that a lot of their younger talent was going to be wiped out. That a lot of people were going to kind of lose their seats, and that doesn't seem to have happened. So I think they should be reasonably confident going into it. On the Republican Party, I think Trump is going to dominate this. I mean, does he run? Does he not run? Can the party face him down? I know there are, it sounds like there are already discussions about whether you can kind of clear the way for Ron DeSantis, but we'll see. I doubt it.
Thanks, Paddy. David, quick comment from you.
Well, just to reiterate, I think the Democrats' success at the state level in these Great Lakes battleground type states from Minnesota over to Pennsylvania is a really big advantage for the Democrats. I think it's going to really give them some energy, give them some hope. If they had lost all of those, I think that would have been very discouraging, not just because those candidates themselves would have lost, but because it meant that you wouldn't have somebody at the top of the government with election administration at stake. So I think the Democrats are going to be happy about that. I think the Democrats are also I think maybe some of them are, and you can sort of get too cute and outthink yourself, but I think Democrats might not be completely opposed to having Republicans in charge of the House. I think they certainly want to keep the Senate for appointments, but I could see, you've heard some commentators say, well, maybe it would be better if Biden didn't have to have all these stories about how he can't get things passed, or maybe it'd be better if he had an actual opponent in charge, if he had McCarthy or somebody else, if they were doing it. And you could imagine also a scenario where the House Republicans and others just go down the rabbit hole of Hunter Biden investigations and things like this. And, I think McConnell had that quote, they said, what are you going to do if you get the majority? And he said, you'll see. In other words, do the Republicans even know? And this continues the question that was asked in the Q&A about how, Republican divisions today. And I think there are lots of divisions. I don't think that the Republicans are like a coherent group in the sense that they want to be traditional, the stereotypical tax cuts for the rich as Democrats would have it, Republicans, or do they want to be populist? I know The Economist had a story saying that, I think it was The Economist saying that Republicans don't know how to do populism. If they could combine sort of a European, culture war, populism, big stateism, then they could put together an electoral majority.
They know how to do it better than the British Conservative Party, I would say at this point, but that's a whole other subject of conversation. Frank, last word from you, looking forward to 2024.
Yes, and I'll do it quick. On the Republican side, watch Tim Scott. On the independent side, watch Joe Manchin. And on the Democratic side, watch Mitch Landrieu. I think all three of them have the potential to be breakout stars to challenge Ron DeSantis for the leader of the next generation of presidential candidates.
That is fantastic. Thank you. Andrew Gillespie, Patrick Anderlecht, David Leal, and Frank Luntz. Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate your time. To everyone watching this, I'm so sorry that I didn't get through all of your questions. That was always going to happen, but thank you so much for your participation. This has been fantastic. This will also go up. People may be watching this recording. I hope to see all 4 of you panels here in person at the REI before too long. But for now, from here, goodbye and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
That was brilliant. Thank you all so much. Thank you.